name for it. But it is a show that is committed to sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. The Gospels, he calls it different things. It's the gospel of the poor, the good news to the poor, the good news of the kingdom, the gospel of the kingdom of heaven. And so it's a commitment to that there's a lot of primary messages in our culture today, but there's one counter message that, if received, can change the world and definitely change individual lives. So that's the purpose of the show. As I said, my name is Carlos Walker, my bride and girlfriend and wife of 17 years. We married in 2005, and we we had was it a 7-year plan that we wouldn't have any children for
something like that,
5 or 7 years, and we were paying for all this birth control, and I told her I wanted to get a refund after year one. Because we were immediately, as one mentor used to say, we had our first child, about 11, 12 months into our first marriage. So, like I said, Rochelle Walker's her name, and you can introduce and tell a little bit about yourself, what you do, other than boss me around. And I like to joke and say that we have 3 boys, but she has 4. So
we do. We have 3 boys. CJ is 16, William is 13, and David is 11. And we have a daughter, Kennedy. She is 22. Carlos had her before he met me. And right now I'm a 6th grade teacher at Bethel Academy, and it has been...
Shout out to Bethel.
It's been 6 years now that I've been doing that.
Wow.
Before that, I homeschooled my boys, and we kind of did different things. But when we got married, I was working in the hospital, working towards being an RN, doing different jobs within the hospital. And then when I became a mom, everything changed. And so I was also in the Army, and that was one thing about the Army. They really drill in you that you're a soldier first before you're anything. And when I became a mom, CJ, I had to make a decision because he was 4 months old and he was sick, and I wanted to stay home with him. And they said that I couldn't, that I had to find somebody to take care of him. And that was like, well, I'm a mom first.
That was a deal breaker.
That was a deal breaker for me.
Yeah.
And so I did that, and then had plans when I had CJ to go back to work and to keep doing it. But as soon as they laid him on my chest, it was like, I'm staying home.
Yeah.
So I've been home with the kids, and now I'm teaching at a school, and it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm an accountant by trade. And me and my wife, we run a small tax and accounting bookkeeping business, but that's not what this is about. But that's what I do for a living. We're both natives of Kansas City.
Yep.
Born and raised. We attend church here locally. As a matter of fact, I met my wife at church.
We did meet at church.
So she wooed me. I was resistant, but but we met at church, and and that's kind of who we are.
Yeah.
We look exactly the way we are, just kind of boring, homespun homebodies that we don't do a whole lot of anything. We work, love Jesus, and try to raise our family, honor him in whatever we do. So our program, like I said, will be the gospel, sharing the good news, interview format, conversational, sometimes sermon, maybe even Bible study But I just had this impression as I was praying a while ago that the Lord had years ago spoken to me. I've heard audibly that I can honestly say that. And I woke up out of a dead sleep, and I sat up in my bed, and he told me, evangelize your neighborhood. And it was like deafening in my ears. And he keeps bringing me back to that. And I've tried it different ways. I thought maybe I would be a pastor. That didn't work. Or you're a traditional preacher in a church, and that didn't work. And he had a different path. And so I never really fully knew what it would look like. And when I was 18, 19 years old, I had a radio program on an AM dial. And it was actually one of the top rated radio programs at that time on the AM dial. And all it was interview mode. And I would have different speakers. They would come in and we would talk about different topics, but it always came back around to the glorification of Christ. And so I'm thinking that would probably be this model, but we'll see. Today, my wife had the great suggestion that I should probably share my testimony.
Yes.
And so she'll ask some questions to kind of get things going or to pull them out. So you want to start with what a question?
So tell us, Carlos, when was what was it like when you grew up?
So I have a really interesting background, and I'm so grateful because our background makes us who we are. It's our blueprint, our fingerprint, I'll say, that we leave on this world. But I'll start with my parents' background because that's the foundation of who I am. So my father's side of the family, as I've been told, came to the Kansas City area through the Underground Railroad. I have been told, of course, I have no way of verifying this, so it's just kind of what the family has told me, that a great-great-grandfather escaped slavery. He had assaulted his slave master because the slave master assaulted his girlfriend. And he fled for his life through the Underground Railroad and came through Quindaro, the old Quindaro town over in Kansas City, Kansas, and changed his last name to Hyde, because he was a fugitive, to Walker.
Okay.
So I'm going to get one of those DNA tests and kind of see, where my family really is. But his last name wasn't Walker, but since Walker was a prominent name in the Kansas City area at that time, he adopted the name Walker, and that's how my father's side of the family came to Kansas City. My mother's side of the family, now my maternal grandfather, is still alive. He's 104. Matter of fact, he's living with me right now while he's on hospice. His grandparents, born in the 1850s, they died when he was, a young boy, 10, 11, 12. They were slaves. They were born in the 1850s. And so they came up through South Carolina, Charleston, slave port there, and eventually migrated through Arkansas. And then during the Great Migration from the South to the industrial Midwest and Mid-Atlantic, my mother's side of the family ended up in Kansas City that way. And my grandfather, because his grandparents were slaves, he grew up really harsh. He would attribute the way they treated his parents, et cetera, was because of the slavery background. And so he was really hard, with all due respect to him, toward his kids. My mother told us when she was growing up as a young girl, my grandfather, her dad, hit her in the head with a hammer to discipline her. And so you had that kind of really hard upbringing.
Well, it's probably all he knew.
Yeah, it was all he knew. And a lot of times that's what parents, most parents do the best they can with what they have. And, you don't appreciate that until you become one. You see your own brokenness.
Right.
And so my mother, she kind of fled early, and as a young woman, she was raped, and she's told me that it's okay to share that already. She was raped and decided to keep her child, which is my oldest brother.
Yeah.
So she had a lot of brokenness. You know, you could think about a tender, young, you know, pretty 18, 19, 20-year-old girl, woman, looking for love, rejected by her father, and just wanted some tenderness.
Yeah.
Along come my dad, who he was the youngest of five, the only boy.
The only boy.
He was sexually assaulted as a young man by his father, unfortunately, as I've been told. And so he had his own broken issues that he was dealing with. He wooed my mother. They actually met on the bus, and she had my oldest brother as a toddler, and he kind of wooed her, and they eventually had 6 children together.
Yeah.
So my father, may he rest in peace, he died in 2009. He wasn't a good father. He wasn't a good husband. He was in prison most of my life when he finally got out. And so I had my mother's brokenness and desperation, and then I had my father, who was sexually assaulted, looking for some type of, you know, peace, justice, or whatever.
Yeah.
He turned to drugs. He started doing drugs when he told me, like 16, 17 years old in the 60s.
Wow.
Which would have been the heroin epidemic that would have happened in the black communities. And then he got involved in drugs and crime and ended up in prison. I looked at his record once. He went to as early as the 70s when he went to prison for the first time.
Wow.
It said he was released in 79, and that would be about my first memory of him. I was born in 72.
Okay.
And so I actually have a really vivid memory of sitting on the porch steps and him being dropped off in a brown van with Prison Blues on, and that was one of my very first memories of him.
So you're about 7 or 8.
Yeah, 79. Yeah, and I can remember that so vividly. Sitting on the porch, I just happened to be outside when he came home. So at any rate, you know, like I said, my mother kept my brother. And there was, you know, a lot of times with step parenting, blended families, there's just tension. And so my father and my oldest brother never really got along. And so fast forward, I'm about 10 years old now. My oldest brother is about in his late teens, early 20s. And they get into a conflict. My dad's out of jail. He was in and out. And they get into this, an argument. And my mom that Saturday morning tells my oldest sister, if your dad comes around, do not let him in the house.
Okay.
And so this was about the time, do not let him in the house. And so like I said, I'm 10 years old. At that stage and age in a young man's life, you know, your dad's a hero, you know, no matter what. And so I remember I was actually in a tree. I was sitting in a tree, and I saw my dad pull up in one of those lone brown Pontiacs. He always in a brown car, it seems like. And I jump out of the tree, and I'm running toward him, and he didn't respond to me. He usually would pick me up and hug me or something. But he had this serious gait, like he was not marching, but like he had this walk, like he was determined, like he had somewhere to go.
Okay.
And I ran up on him on his left side, and so I noticed he was trying to conceal something on his right side, and I didn't know what it was. And so I'm just gabbing away like any 10-year-old boy would, and I can't remember what questions I was asking. And then everything just kind of slowed down at that point. I can remember my sister yelling, "Mother said, don't let him in the house." And so, and then I look at him, and I finally see what he had on his right side. It was a shotgun.
Wow.
And he raises his shotgun, and my oldest brother comes down the stairs, and he shoots my oldest brother.
With you by his side?
While I'm standing right by his side as a 10-year-old. I'm standing on his left, and he pulls his gun up, and he shoots my brother. He didn't die. He struggles back up the stairs, and he shoots him again. And then he struggles a little bit more, and he ends up in my sister's bed. My sister's screaming frantically. Obviously, blood is everywhere.
Yeah.
And then he raises the shotgun and puts it to my brother's head while I'm still standing next to him. And my sister's in the bed next to our brother, and she's screaming, and my brother's, bleeding everywhere.
Wow.
And
so at this point, he made it inside the house.
Oh yeah, he had made it. Yeah, once I had opened the door, right?
Okay.
And I don't even think it was locked. Otherwise, I would have been locked out. But and so he says, I'm not going to shoot you because it would. We said, I'm not going to kill you. Okay. Because something like that, it would destroy your mother, and he leaves, and literally it leaves us in a pool of blood. Wow. And my brother limps to my grandmother's house around the corner, and so that one event cascaded a lot of things. I remember about the same time, and I kind of jumped ahead. My mother kept us in church, which we hated then, but thank God now. Right. We lived on 22nd Street over in Kansas City, Kansas, 21st Street, excuse me, and our church was on 8th Street, and my mother would get all 7 of us up every Sunday morning. We would walk from 21st Street down to 8th Street and be the first ones there. For whatever reason, my mother has never owned a car, never driven before. Had never learned how to ride a bike. I don't know what that's about, but so she would walk, and I remember, this is key to what the story that I'm telling. I remember right before that, Sunday school and all the Bible stories, Adam and Eve and Abraham and Isaac and David and Goliath, all your what you would expect the Bible stories to be. Yeah. And I was just really just enthralled by the Lord. Like I mean, at a young age, I fell in love with Jesus, and so right before that, I remember the pastor of the church at that time he would give these strong Pentecostal fire and brimstone kind of messages, get right or get left kind of thing. And I remember sitting up late at night, looking out my window, thinking, is this going to be the day the Lord returns kind of thing. So it's such a deep anticipation for his return, because I understood that when he comes, he's going to make all things right. And John, even then, when he would preach and he taught about John, he would make the raise the valleys and lower the mountains and make the crooked paths. He's going to make a way for his coming and make a way for those to get to him. Yeah. And so I grew up with that kind of anticipation for him breaking in. So I remember right around the time before my brother was shot, I remember responding to the gospel call and the coming down to the altar. And I went to the altar. And because I was a kid, there's no, these days there's youth churches and children's church and youth ministry. And they didn't have that back then. So I went to the altar to give my life to Christ, 9, 10 years old. And they didn't take me serious. And so they gave the benediction, closed the service without anybody coming to pray for me. But, me being as determined as I can be, I was like, next Sunday, I'm going to give my life to Christ. They're not going to. Right. And so the next Sunday I went down. So again, this is a Pentecostal church. I went down to the altar and I gave my life to Christ, and the Holy Spirit comes over me. And I'm like weeping and crying, and I couldn't stop. You know, they, as Pentecostals say, speaking in tongues in a prayer language. So I'm like at 10 years old, and I have this, I cannot control it. I'm weeping. I'm even thinking to myself, why can't I stop? And I'm praying in tongues and speaking in tongues. And then we got a ride home. We would walk to church, but another lady would give us a ride home. And I don't know how all like 7 of us and her 2 or 3 kids we would fit in the back of this car.
Wow.
But I was literally like on one side, and all of them were like piled up, like staring at me like, what is because I'm in the car still crying and weeping. The power of the Lord was so strong on me.
Wow.
And the Holy Spirit, I'm still weeping in spirit and praying in the spirit. And my mother gets me out of the car, and I get like it was yesterday. She walks me up the steps in the house and sits me on the side of the bed, and she leaves me in the room like that, and I'm just hours just weeping in the Holy Spirit. And it was shortly after that this incident happened with my dad.
Yeah.
And I really believe that the Lord just downloaded His Spirit on me to preserve me, because for the next 10 years after my dad shot my brother, it was like the darkest period in my life. With my dad being gone, we plummeted into poverty.
Because did he go to jail for that?
He went to jail, absolutely. Yeah, he went to jail until I was about late teens, so almost 10 years he went to prison. So we were this is the late 70s. Yeah, late 70s, early 80s. And you know, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, high inflation. I remember our utilities being turned off all the time. Yeah. My mom running extension cords into the house for electricity and lights, and we had one hot plate where she would boil water to wash our face and cook with, and we didn't have, you know, this is back in the day to where the gas company could turn off your heat in the middle of the winter.
Yeah.
Now it's illegal. Yeah. Back then, they would turn your stuff off, and the way we stayed warm it was fun back then. It wasn't for my mother, I'm sure, but me and my brothers, we had bunk beds, so she showed us how to layer the bunk beds. So there was 3 or 4 covers all around, and it created like a little teepee, and our body heat, and what we would also have on coats and jackets and snowsuits and 4 or 5 pair of socks, and we thought it was the funnest thing
like
ever. But that's how we would stay warm in the winter. And I remember, you know, just the poverty. I picked up a sense of shame. I don't know where it came from, but I didn't want to go to school anymore. I figured everyone knew what happened. Like everybody knew what my dad had done. And so I started leaving school. You know, back then you would walk 3-4 miles to school, and I would go to school because my mom would send me. And then I would wait an hour or two, and I would just walk out of the building. I mean, now they got cameras and the doors locked and all that. Right. You can't do it now, but it's just this deep shame and rejection came over me. I really, at 10 years old, I think, you know, when you share your story, you can relate about at that age needing your mom when you were becoming a young woman and no one was there. And I was becoming a young man, and I didn't have anybody, and I was confused, and I didn't know. Yeah. And then we were in poverty, and I would see my mother go to church, and, you know, she was generous, and if she didn't have money, she would bring groceries to church to donate because she didn't have money to give, and she would find another needy family to give to and food out of her refrigerator. And I would cry out to the Lord, you know. So let me back up. You know, after I had that Holy Spirit encounter, there was no discipleship for children. I mean, I went to a really harsh elementary school, and probably about a week later, I was back at cursing and fighting, but that gave me a life of prayer then, and every night I would pray, Lord, save my soul, faithfully every night, and I would fast as a young boy from like 8, 9, 10 years old. And I would fast every week probably until like the last 5, 7 years ago. I stopped fasting at least one day a week, and I should definitely get back to it. But I had this sense of crying out to the Lord. So here I am. I got this shame. My dad's in prison. My family's broken, and I'm asking Lord, why are we so poor? Why won't you help us? And then I go to school. Now we're in the early 90s now, and I see my friends that was in the elementary school with me. And at the time, they had the Run DMC Adidas, and they had the gold chains, and they were pulling out wads of money. And I'm like,
what are they doing?
now my aunt gave me a lawnmower, and I worked with the lawnmower, but I was getting like $5-7 a yard.
Wow.
But my friends would have same age. They have $200-$400 in cash on them at school, and I got $14.
Right.
Nice shoes. I had never had a new pair of shoes as a kid. It was always like thrift store shoes. And so, back in the early 90s, I did or tried to do what every other young black man in the hood did. I tried to sell drugs and try to be hard, and tried to get into I keep saying tried because it wasn't, I mean, it was bad, but it wasn't nothing like other places. And so I started that at around, I was a straight A student until I got in like the 7th or 8th grade, and I started seeing that, hey, I could do illegal things to make more money, and then I started going down that path. And then around 13, maybe 14 years old, first time I got arrested. And then I was arrested on a regular basis, probably once a month. I would go to jail.
For selling drugs or
whatever, driving without a license, driving with a suspended tag, possession of drugs. Then I started getting kicked out of school. I had gotten kicked out of, I was in District 500. I had gotten kicked out of every school in the state of Kansas. They had like banned me from going to any school in the state of Kansas. Because again, back then you get kicked out of one school, you just go enroll in the other because they didn't have computers to match records. And then if you got kicked out of all of the schools in Kansas, you just come over here to Missouri side. And then, so I went to Southeast for a little bit and got kicked out of there. So here I am, from about 14 to 18 years old, I'm in this loop. I was an alcoholic. That's all I did was drink. I was afraid of drugs, but I would drink. Violence, so I was fighting teachers, fighting the security guards. I hated male authority because of my dad, even my grandfather who's living with me now. I felt like we're poor examples. Pastors were a ripoff. Didn't like principals. I hated cops. That was the F the police, era. And so I just resisted, any male authority. And so 14 to like 16, 17, 18 years old, I'm just in this cycle. I didn't even think I would live to see 18. I got, like I said, tried to get into gangs, and we were doing stupid stuff, and found myself in a couple of shootouts or gang bangs and battles and fights and all of that.
And your mom was working.
By this time, my mom, because she had dropped out of school, when my youngest brother was born and able to start kindergarten, she went back to school and got her GED, and then she went to get her cosmetology license. So about this time, we were home alone all the time. We were latchkey kids. And so, she would leave us, and she had no idea, I mean, by this time, on a school night, I was still coming in at 3 a.m. I would sneak out of the house and get out in the streets and then climb back in the window and go to school and drink alcohol on the school bus and walk around with, literally, I would have a Coca-Cola can in one hand with half Coke and half brandy. And I'm walking around the school sipping on that all day long. And so, it was just dark. A dark era in my life, but I was still praying every night. I would end my day with with the prayer, Lord, save me, save my family, bless my mom, don't let me die and go to hell.
Drunk and all.
Drunk and all. And I mean, by that time, I've had like at least paid for 2 abortions, 2 teen pregnancies.
Wow.
And so it was just, you know, I'm every time I'm amazed at how I made it out. So I was going back and forth to juvenile court.
Yeah.
Kicked out of, at this time, I had gotten kicked out of the school, state of Kansas, like, you're done. You can never come back. I'm 18 years old.
What was your social life like? Like, did you have a lot of friends or?
Yeah, I did. I mean, eventually I did, you know, and then I started seeing all of them die, right?
Okay.
Or go to prison for a really long time. Like, some of them are still there from high school.
Wow.
It was just dark. You know, your friends are dying or in prison because of drugs. It was the 90s. You know, I mean, it was the 90s. If you remember the 90s, the crack epidemic.
Yeah.
It was just a dark, dark time. And late 80s, early 90s. And so eventually I was kind of the, you know, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, I was the good church kid. And my mother's influence still weighed heavy. And so I had straight A's, like I said, and was a good boy. But then the turning point was when I was cutting grass for $14.
Yeah.
And then I go to school, I was like,
what am I doing?
wait a minute, right, I'm the fool, right? And it changed. That changed everything. And so a friend of mine, like you know, like I said, I got arrested for the last time for possession, and kicked out of school. I was trying to get out of the street life, and so at this time I was working at a local grocery store in the bakery, and I was just depressed at that time in my life. I was definitely suicidal, and I was definitely homicidal as well. And a friend of mine in the neighborhood invited me to church. Now, my mother had a rule that as long as you stayed in her house, you had to go to church at least once a week.
Okay.
If you didn't have to work on Sunday, you were expected to be at church on Sunday. If you were working on Sunday, then you can pick one of the weeknight services, but you had to go to church, no question, even if you weren't a believer. So go to church.
And even as a teen.
As a teen, it didn't matter. My oldest brother, who lived, I didn't say that he survived. He was living with us in his 20s, and it was the same rule for him.
Okay.
There's just no question. Parenting was different back then.
Yeah.
But no, you didn't have choices. You did. You had a choice to comply or not, and then there was consequences. So yeah, I kicked out of every school. Yeah. I got busted for drugs, and the same juvenile judge I was going to the whole time. And I know we're running out of time, and maybe we'll pause here, and then I could pick up next week and finish the rest of the story. But I was convicted, and I was sentenced to 5 to 7 years in Hutchinson Penitentiary. And at the time, my dad was there for shooting my brother. And I hadn't seen my dad. I'm 16, 17, 18 maybe then. And I hadn't seen him since he shot my brother, so about 8 years. And so I had these mixed emotions about going to prison. Yeah. That I was going to see my dad for the first time since then. And but I was going to prison. Right. And but I was hopeful that I would be with my dad, and I had this weird vision that I'll get with my dad, and then we'll become like the Corleones or something. The Corleones of prison. And so This was a Friday when my friend invited me to church.
Yeah.
And that Monday I was to be sentenced, and he invited me to church. And so maybe next week we can pick up on the second half.
Okay. That sounds good.
All right. You want to close it? Thanks for joining us. And we'll see you next week, and we'll finish the rest of that story.
Thank you.